Vanessa faced contempt, sexism, and racism every day. Her opinions were ignored, her achievements were belittled, and her colleagues constantly questioned her competence because of her gender and race. What they didn't know was that all the while she was working to become the company's new CEO. Her enemies humiliated her, confident that she was untouchable, but they had no idea that Vanessa would soon take over the company and take it to the next level. Want to know how she succeeded? Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. What do you think will be her first decision as CEO? Vanessa stood in front of the tall, sleek building that housed the headquarters of the prestigious corporation she had just joined. The reflection of the glass exterior mirrored her sharp, confident stance, but underneath her calm demeanor, she felt the familiar surge of anxiety that accompanied the start of any new job. This wasn't just another position, it was a pivotal step in her career, one she had been preparing for her entire life. Clad in a perfectly tailored navy suit, Vanessa adjusted her collar, took a deep breath, and stepped forward into the lobby. The smooth marble floors echoed faintly beneath her heels as she approached the reception desk. A tall, young receptionist, barely acknowledging her, quickly handed her a temporary badge without making eye contact. "Third floor, operations," the receptionist said curtly, her tone brisk. Vanessa nodded, ignoring the subtle brush-off, and moved toward the elevator. This was not the first time she had been underestimated. She had spent years navigating corporate environments where her competence was constantly in question, where she had to prove herself twice as hard just to be seen as equal. But Vanessa was used to it. She had never been the type to let the undercurrent of judgment deter her. What mattered now was this opportunity, a chance to rise through the ranks and finally make the changes she had always dreamed of. The elevator doors slid open, and as Vanessa entered the small, metallic space, she felt the weight of the moment. This was a company known for its size and power, a massive corporation where decisions made at the top rippled through the entire industry. And now, she was part of it. The thought filled her with both excitement and apprehension. She had heard rumors about the company's notorious Old Boys Club, but Vanessa wasn't here to make friends. She was here to succeed, and more importantly, to disrupt the toxic culture she suspected ran deeper than anyone cared to admit. The doors opened with a quiet chime on the third floor, and Vanessa stepped out into a bustling sea of desks and cubicles. The operations department was where the gears of the company turned, and she could immediately feel the energy of the place. Phones rang incessantly, people shuffled paperwork, and a low hum of conversation filled the air. Vanessa made her way through the maze of workstations, eventually reaching her assigned desk at the far end of the room. It wasn't particularly special, just another beige cubicle with a standard-issue computer and phone. Still, this was her starting point. She settled in, unpacking her things and taking a moment to absorb her surroundings. A few glances were thrown her way, some curious, others indifferent, but most people seemed too preoccupied with their own tasks to notice her arrival. For a brief moment, Vanessa was grateful for the anonymity. It gave her time to observe, to figure out who was who and how the department operated. Just as she was about to log into the company's system for the first time, a shadow loomed over her cubicle. She looked up to see a tall, middle-aged man with a smug expression on his face, his arms crossed as he appraised her. "You must be the new hire," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Vanessa smiled politely. "That's right. Vanessa Thomas. I just started today." The man didn't bother to introduce himself. "Well, good luck. Operations is a tough department. Lots of pressure. Hope you can handle it." Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but inside she was already bracing herself. The dismissiveness in his tone was all too familiar. He looked at her the way so many had before, as if she was an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong. "I've handled worse," Vanessa said calmly, her gaze steady. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed, and with a slight nod, walked away without another word. Vanessa exhaled quietly, her grip on the armrest tightening momentarily. She had expected this. She always did. But that didn't make it any easier. Over the course of the morning, Vanessa immersed herself in the company's systems and protocols. She familiarized herself with the workflows, noting areas where processes seemed unnecessarily convoluted or outdated. Her background in strategic operations gave her an edge. She could already see ways to streamline tasks and improve efficiency. But as productive as her work was, the interactions with her new colleagues left a bitter taste. Several times throughout the day, Vanessa was either ignored or interrupted when she tried to share ideas. A male colleague, Eric, had dismissed her input on a scheduling issue only to present the same idea an hour later, passing it off as his own. The group of men at the meeting nodded in approval, and the idea was quickly accepted. Vanessa felt a familiar pang of frustration, but she remained composed. She had learned long ago how to pick her battles, how to maintain her professionalism even when it felt like every contribution she made was being siphoned away by others. By the time lunch rolled around, Vanessa decided to explore the break room. The space was small and cramped, with a few worn-out chairs and a fluorescent light that flickered annoyingly in the corner. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, she overheard a group of male colleagues laughing at a joke in the corner. "Man, can you believe they've got her working in operations?" one of them said, just loud enough for her to hear. "What's next? Sending her to the boardroom? She won't last a week." "Yeah," another voice chimed in. "Bet she'll be fetching coffee before long." Vanessa's hand tightened around her cup. She had dealt with sexist and racist comments before, but hearing it so openly in a professional setting like this was still jarring. She felt the urge to confront them, to call out their ignorance, but instead, she took a deep breath and walked away. Back at her desk, she tried to refocus on her work, but the laughter still echoed in her ears. The subtle and not-so-subtle comments had been a constant in her career, but here, in a place where she had hoped to make real change, it stung even more. The company had boasted about its commitment to diversity and inclusion during her hiring process, but now that she was inside, she saw that the reality was far different. As the day dragged on, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that she had been deliberately underestimated. Throughout the afternoon, more men came by her desk to check in, each one offering unsolicited advice or making veiled comments about how tough the job would be for her. "Don't worry," one said with a wink. "You'll get the hang of it. Just ask one of the guys if you need help." Vanessa smiled politely, but inside she seethed. She didn't need their help. She didn't need their patronizing comments. She had worked her way through tougher environments than this, and she wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded colleagues derail her plans. By the time the workday ended, Vanessa felt drained, not by the workload, but by the constant microaggressions. As she gathered her things to leave, she glanced around the office. The men were chatting casually, some making plans to grab drinks, while the few women she saw were quietly finishing their tasks, almost invisible in the male-dominated space. Walking out of the building, Vanessa took a moment to collect her thoughts. She had known this wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But if there was one thing she was certain of, it was that she belonged here just as much as anyone else, and she wasn't going to let their small-mindedness stop her. As she drove home, Vanessa replayed the events of the day in her mind. The subtle and overt displays of sexism, the casual racism, the dismissiveness. It was all too familiar. But she had made it through worse. Tomorrow she would come back stronger, more focused, and more determined than ever. Because if they thought they could break her spirit, they were wrong. Vanessa Thomas wasn't just here to work. She was here to change the game. And by the time she was done, this company would never be the same. The second morning at Whitman Enterprises felt heavier than the first. Vanessa knew that the honeymoon phase, if there ever was one, was already over. She had been mentally prepared for the undercurrent of racism and sexism she had sensed during her first day, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the weight of enduring it day after day. As she walked through the gleaming glass doors, the usual hustle of the operations department greeted her. Yet, Vanessa could sense something off, something intangible in the atmosphere that felt almost like a deliberate coldness. People greeted each other, laughed in groups, but when she passed, there was silence. eyes subtly following her as though waiting for her to falter. She reached her desk, and just as she sat down, she noticed a post-it note stuck to her computer screen. Written in hastily scrawled handwriting, it read, "You sure you're in the right department?" Vanessa stared at the note, her chest tightening slightly, but her outward expression remained neutral. It was an anonymous jab, cowardly and calculated to throw her off balance. Her hands tightened around the edge of the desk as she slowly crumpled the note in her fist. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than confrontation when dealing with such petty provocations. But this was just the beginning. She could feel it. She threw the note into the trash and began her work. As the day wore on, Vanessa became even more attuned to the subtle but pervasive discrimination in the office. When she spoke up in meetings, her ideas were routinely brushed aside or appropriated by her male colleagues, much like Eric had done the previous day. It was a pattern she had seen before. The meetings themselves were dominated by men, and when the few women in the room spoke, they were interrupted or talked over. Worse yet, whenever Vanessa voiced a suggestion or a strategic improvement, the men seemed to take it as a personal challenge rather than a contribution. By midday, it became impossible to ignore the full scope of the problem. During a lunch break in the cramped office kitchen, Vanessa overheard a conversation that made her skin crawl. "I'm telling you, she's just here to fill some diversity quota," a familiar voice said. It was Eric, the same man who had stolen her idea the day before. "Well, she'll learn quick enough that this isn't some charity. Let her drown in ops for a while, she'll be out of here in no time," another voice chimed in. Vanessa didn't recognize this one, but the derision in his tone was unmistakable. "She doesn't even belong here," Eric continued, his voice lower now, but still filled with malice. "You know they only hired her because they needed more women of color for the numbers. She's got no chance." Vanessa's grip tightened on her coffee cup as she listened to them laugh, oblivious to the fact that she could hear every word. She took a slow, deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. It wasn't the first time she'd heard this type of talk, but the casual nature of it stung nonetheless. These weren't just co-workers. They were people who, despite the corporate rhetoric of equality, still saw her as an outsider, someone unworthy of being part of their world. When she walked past them to refill her coffee, the men fell silent. Eric's eyes met hers for a brief moment, a flicker of surprise passing through his expression. He hadn't expected her to hear, but instead of embarrassment, his gaze hardened, as though daring her to say something. Vanessa gave him a cold, even stare before turning away without a word. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. She had dealt with bigger obstacles than a group of bigoted men who couldn't stand seeing someone like her in their space. Still, the feeling of isolation sank deeper. This was a company that liked to brand itself as progressive, but the rot of discrimination was deeply embedded in its foundations. The culture of sexism and racism wasn't just present, it was actively encouraged, even if unspoken. The next few days followed a similar pattern, but with each passing hour, the cracks in the company's culture became more glaring. On Thursday morning, Vanessa was invited to an all-department meeting to discuss an upcoming project. The topic was an important one. The company was planning to launch a new logistics system, and the meeting was designed to brainstorm potential issues and solutions. Vanessa had spent the last 3 days thoroughly researching the system, looking for ways to streamline the launch and avoid unnecessary delays. She had compiled a detailed report, complete with suggestions on how to optimize the existing processes and reduce costs. Confident in her findings, she entered the meeting room prepared to share her ideas. The room was already full by the time she arrived, the air thick with chatter. Vanessa spotted Eric at the far end of the table, talking animatedly with a few other men. She took her seat near the center, ready to contribute. As the meeting began, the department head Paul quickly took control. He was an older man, well established in the company, and known for his sharp, no-nonsense approach. He was also known for his blatant favoritism, often dismissing the contributions of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of leadership. Vanessa listened quietly as the discussion unfolded, waiting for the right moment to present her ideas. But each time she tried to speak, Paul or one of the other men would cut her off, redirecting the conversation away from her point. It wasn't just her. They did it to other women in the room as well. One woman, Julia, attempted to raise a concern about the technical limitations of the new system, but she was immediately interrupted by Paul, who dismissed her point with a wave of his hand. "That's not important right now," he said. "Let's focus on the bigger picture." Vanessa clenched her teeth. This was a blatant pattern, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. The women in the room exchanged frustrated glances, but none of them spoke up. They had learned the hard way that speaking out would only make them targets for more dismissal, or worse, retribution. As the meeting dragged on, Vanessa's frustration grew. Finally, when there was a brief lull in the conversation, she seized the opportunity. "I have a report," Vanessa began, her voice clear and steady. "I've identified several key areas where we can streamline the system and cut costs without sacrificing quality. I think it's important we address these issues before we move forward with the launch." Paul barely looked up from his notes. "We've already covered that, Vanessa," he said dismissively. "We don't need to revisit it." Vanessa blinked, momentarily stunned. They hadn't covered any of the points she was about to raise. But before she could respond, Eric jumped in. "Actually," Eric said, his tone smug, "I was thinking along the same lines. I've been reviewing the system, and I think we could make some optimizations." He proceeded to outline the exact suggestions Vanessa had prepared in her report, word for word. The men around the table nodded in agreement, praising Eric for his insight. Vanessa felt the heat rise in her chest. This was beyond infuriating. It was blatant theft of her work. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Paul cut her off once again. "Good thinking, Eric," Paul said with a nod. "Let's move forward with those adjustments." The meeting moved on without her. That night, Vanessa sat at home, replaying the day's events in her mind. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be treated like this. The frustration gnawed at her, but so did something else: resolve. She couldn't continue to sit idly by while the company's toxic culture festered. If she didn't take action, nothing would change. Vanessa had always known she was destined for something more, and this injustice, was the catalyst she needed to make a real impact. She began to formulate a plan. The culture at Whitman Enterprises wasn't going to change on its own. It was too deeply ingrained, too comfortable in its sexism and racism. But change could happen if someone was willing to push hard enough. Vanessa was that someone. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to be just another victim of their prejudices. She was going to rise through this company, expose its ugly underbelly, and dismantle the discriminatory structures that held it together. The men who thought they could silence her, the colleagues who thought they could steal her ideas and take credit for her work, they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Vanessa wasn't here just to do a job. She was here to change the system. And when she was done, they would have no choice but to reckon with the force she would become. She looked out the window into the quiet night, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, the fight would begin in earnest. The next day, Vanessa came to the office with a new sense of purpose. The hostility and underhanded tactics her colleagues were employing weren't going to stop her. She was done playing by their unspoken rules and being the quiet observer. Today, she was prepared for battle. As she entered the building, Vanessa braced herself for the usual wave of indifference and disdain that met her every morning. But this time, it felt different. The silent stares, the whispered conversations, none of it touched her now. She had a mission, and they were nothing more than obstacles to overcome. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, ready to dive into the work she'd meticulously prepared. But as she scrolled through her inbox, a new message caught her eye. The subject line read, "Performance Review Scheduled." Vanessa's stomach tightened as she clicked the email open. It was from Paul, the department head. He had scheduled an impromptu performance review with her, set for that afternoon. This was unusual. Normally, performance reviews were planned well in advance and aligned with the company's quarterly evaluations. Vanessa hadn't been at the company long enough to warrant an official review, and the fact that Paul was pulling her in now felt suspicious. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of retaliation? She had spoken up in the meetings, challenged the status quo, and refused to back down. The men who had undermined her clearly didn't appreciate her persistence, and now it seemed they were making their next move. When the time for the review came, Vanessa made her way to Paul's office, her mind still sharp and focused despite the anxiety brewing in the pit of her stomach. As she entered the room, she saw Paul sitting behind his desk, a smug expression on his face. Eric was also there, leaning casually against a filing cabinet, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Vanessa felt the tension in the air immediately. This wasn't going to be a normal review. It was a setup, a carefully planned ambush to make her look bad, to question her competence, and to undermine her confidence. "Vanessa, please have a seat," Paul said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. She sat down, maintaining a calm exterior, but her senses were on high alert. She had to be careful with her words, knowing they were likely waiting for any excuse to criticize her. Paul leaned forward, clasping his hands together as he spoke. "We've been reviewing your performance over the last few weeks, and there are a few concerns we need to address." "Concerns?" Vanessa repeated, keeping her voice neutral. Paul nodded, his tone patronizing. "Yes. While you've shown some initiative, there have been instances where your input hasn't aligned with the company's direction. We're a team here, Vanessa, and part of being a team player is knowing when to follow the lead of your colleagues." Vanessa's blood boiled at his words. This wasn't about her performance, it was about control. She wasn't conforming to their expectations, wasn't playing the role they wanted her to play, and now they were trying to put her in her place. Eric chimed in, his tone dripping with false concern. "Yeah, Vanessa, you've been pushing pretty hard on certain projects, but sometimes you just have to trust the process. We've been doing things this way for a while, and it works." Vanessa clenched her fists under the table, fighting to keep her expression composed. "I understand that there's an established way of doing things here," she said carefully, "but part of my role is to find ways to improve those processes. That's why I was brought in." Paul leaned back in his chair, giving her a condescending smile. "That's true, but there's a fine line between offering suggestions and overstepping boundaries. You need to learn when to step back and let the more experienced team members take the lead." Vanessa could hardly believe what she was hearing. They were trying to frame her assertiveness as insubordination, twisting her efforts to contribute into a narrative that made her seem overbearing or difficult. But she wasn't about to let them corner her. She had worked too hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let their thinly veiled racism and sexism derail her progress. "I appreciate the feedback," Vanessa said, her voice steady but firm. "But I believe that the ideas I've presented have value. I'm here to help the company grow, and that means challenging old practices when necessary." Paul's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected her to push back so confidently. Eric, however, wasn't about to back down. He gave her a smug look before turning to Paul. "Look, Paul, I think we can all agree that Vanessa's ideas, while interesting, might not be what the company needs right now. She's still learning the ropes, and maybe we should give her more time to adjust before she tries to change how we operate." Vanessa's jaw tightened. The patronizing tone, the backhanded compliment, it was all part of their strategy to diminish her, to make her seem small and insignificant. Paul nodded slowly, as if considering Eric's words. "I think that's fair. Vanessa, we'll give you more time to settle in and observe how we do things here. In the meantime, I'd suggest focusing on following the team's lead. We'll revisit your progress in a few months." Vanessa knew what they were doing. They wanted her to sit quietly, to blend into the background, to let the men take credit for everything while she faded into obscurity. But that wasn't going to happen. She had come too far to let them silence her. She stood up, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. "Thank you for the review," she said, meeting Paul's gaze head-on. "I'll continue to do my best for the company, but I won't stop pushing for improvement." Paul's smile had completely disappeared now. He didn't say anything as she turned and left the room, but Vanessa could feel his eyes burning into her back. That evening, as Vanessa sat at home, reflecting on the day's events, she realized something important. The men at Whitman Enterprises were trying to wear her down, to push her out slowly and systematically. But all they had done was strengthen her resolve. The sexism and racism she had encountered were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, deeply entrenched culture that thrived on exclusion and silence. But Vanessa wasn't going to play by their rules. She wasn't going to sit quietly and wait for things to change on their own. She opened her laptop and began to research. She needed to understand more about the company's internal structures, about the people in power and the dynamics at play. If she was going to fight this system, she needed to know exactly where to strike. As the hours passed, she uncovered more and more about Whitman Enterprises. The board was made up almost entirely of white men, most of whom had been with the company for decades. Promotions were rarely based on merit, but rather on personal connections and loyalty to the old guard. And the few women and people of color who had risen through the ranks had either conformed completely to the company's toxic culture or had been pushed out before they could make real changes. Vanessa saw the pattern clearly now. This wasn't just a case of a few bad apples, this was a systemic problem. And if she wanted to succeed, she couldn't just fight for herself. She had to fight for everyone in the company who had been marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. She began to map out her next steps. She would start by building alliances, finding other employees who were frustrated with the status quo and wanted to see real change. She would create a network of support, a coalition of people who were tired of being held back by the company's oppressive culture. Vanessa knew it wouldn't be easy. The men in power weren't going to give up their positions without a fight. But she also knew that she wasn't alone in this. There were others like her, others who had been waiting for someone to stand up and lead the charge. And Vanessa was ready to be that leader. The morning after her so-called performance review, Vanessa entered the office with a sharpened focus. The air felt thick with the undercurrents of tension and silent judgments from her colleagues, but she walked through it unfazed. She had seen their strategy for what it was, an attempt to discredit and isolate her. But they had underestimated her determination. Today was about taking the first steps to build something much larger than herself, something that would expose the toxic culture she had endured. Vanessa knew the importance of allies. No one could dismantle an entrenched system alone, and she wasn't so naive as to think that the company would change with a few strong words or a lone act of defiance. She had to gather people who were equally frustrated, equally tired of being minimized, ignored, or passed over. The people who had seen the system from the inside and wanted out of it, or better yet, wanted to destroy it and build something better. Vanessa's first move was subtle. Over the next few days, she began to strike up conversations with a variety of employees, those in middle management, assistants, even janitorial staff. It wasn't just about making small talk. She needed to get a sense of the mood beneath the surface, to understand how widespread the discontent was and how deep it ran. Whitman Enterprises was a large company, but she was betting that her experiences were far from unique. Her first real conversation took place in the break room with a woman named Cynthia. Cynthia worked in HR and had been at the company for over a decade. She was well-connected, friendly, but had an air of exhaustion about her that Vanessa immediately recognized. Cynthia was tired of seeing the same problems, the same politics, and the same faces being rewarded for doing little more than maintaining the status quo. As they sat down with their coffee, Vanessa casually mentioned her performance review, feeling out how much she could trust Cynthia. "They said I was pushing too hard," Vanessa said, her tone light but with a tinge of sarcasm. "Apparently, offering suggestions is crossing boundaries now." Cynthia raised her eyebrows. "Let me guess. Paul and Eric?" she asked knowingly. Vanessa nodded, and Cynthia shook her head with a bitter smile. "That's how they play the game. Seen it 100 times before." Vanessa leaned in slightly. "It doesn't bother you?" How they keep using the same tactics to shut people down? Cynthia sighed, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Oh, it bothers me. But what am I supposed to do? HR is supposed to be neutral, right? That's what they say, at least. But in reality, we're just here to protect the company from any real change. It's exhausting. This was exactly what Vanessa had suspected. The discontent was there, but it was buried under layers of resignation. People like Cynthia had been worn down over the years, made to believe that they couldn't fight back because the system was too strong. Vanessa saw her opportunity. I hear you, Vanessa said quietly, her voice filled with understanding. But what if we could change it? What if we had enough people willing to push back? Cynthia gave her a skeptical look. You really think that's possible? I've seen too many people try and fail. They get pushed out, or worse, they get quiet and just play along. Vanessa met her gaze, unflinching. I don't plan on playing along, and I'm not getting pushed out. Cynthia hesitated for a moment, then gave Vanessa a long, appraising look. You're serious, aren't you? I am, Vanessa said, her voice firm. But I'm not stupid. I know this won't work if it's just me. That's why I need people like you, people who know the system and know how to fight it. Cynthia was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay, I'm in. But be careful, Vanessa. They'll try to destroy you if they think you're a threat. Vanessa smiled, a determined glint in her eye. Let them try. With Cynthia on her side, Vanessa had a valuable ally, someone who knew the inner workings of HR and could help her navigate the bureaucratic maze of Whitman Enterprises. But she needed more. She needed people from every department, at every level, to build a coalition strong enough to force real change. Her next target was Marcus, one of the few black men in a leadership position at the company. Marcus was in charge of a small team in the IT department, and though he was well respected for his technical skills, Vanessa had noticed how often his suggestions were brushed aside in meetings, or how he was constantly given the most difficult assignments without any of the corresponding recognition. Vanessa caught up with Marcus in the hallway one afternoon. He was headed to yet another meeting, his expression tired but focused. Hey, Marcus, she called, falling into step beside him. He glanced at her, his face brightening slightly. Hey, Vanessa, how's it going? Surviving, she said with a smirk. You look like you're heading into the lion's den. He chuckled. Feels like it. These meetings are brutal. Everyone wants something, but no one's willing to listen to the people actually doing the work. Vanessa nodded, sensing an opening. I know the feeling. Seems like the company's more interested in preserving its image than actually listening to its employees. Marcus shot her a sharp look, clearly intrigued. You notice that too? Hard not to, Vanessa replied. I've been here long enough to see how things really work, and from what I can tell, people like us aren't exactly at the top of their list of priorities. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. Yeah, no kidding. I've been here 5 years, and I'm still fighting to get my ideas taken seriously. Meanwhile, I watch guys with half the experience get promoted just because they know the right people. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. It's the same story across the board. But what if we could change that? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Change? How? I've been talking to a few people, Vanessa said carefully. People who are just as tired of the way things are. I think if we band together, if we start pushing back as a group, they'll have no choice but to listen. Marcus seemed to consider this for a moment. I don't know, Vanessa. This place is entrenched. They've been doing things this way for years. I've seen people come in with big ideas and get crushed. I'm not talking about one person, Vanessa said, her tone more insistent. I'm talking about a movement. Enough voices speaking together can't be ignored. Marcus was silent for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, I'm in. But if we're doing this, we have to be smart. They'll try to shut us down the second they see us coming. Vanessa smiled. I wouldn't expect anything less. With Marcus and Cynthia on board, Vanessa felt the first stirrings of momentum. But she wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, she continued to have quiet, strategic conversations with key employees. Some were hesitant at first, unsure of whether it was worth the risk, but others, like Cynthia and Marcus, were ready for a change. She found support in unexpected places. An assistant in the finance department who had been passed over for promotions time and time again, despite being the most qualified person in the room, a junior executive in marketing who had grown tired of watching her ideas get stolen by her male counterparts, and even a security guard who had witnessed countless instances of discrimination but had never felt empowered to speak up. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, and slowly but surely, Vanessa was building a network of allies, all of whom shared the same goal: dismantling the toxic culture at Whitman Enterprises. But not everyone was easy to convince. Vanessa's biggest challenge came in the form of Lydia, a senior manager in the legal department. Lydia had been with the company for nearly 20 years and had worked her way up from the bottom. She was tough, no-nonsense, and fiercely loyal to the company. Vanessa knew that if she could win Lydia over, it would be a huge victory for their cause. Vanessa scheduled a one-on-one lunch with Lydia under the guise of discussing a recent legal project. As they sat down at a small cafe near the office, Vanessa quickly realized that this was going to be a much harder sell than she had anticipated. "You want to take down the system?" Lydia said bluntly, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. "You realize what you're up against, right?" Vanessa didn't flinch. "I do. But I also know that the system is broken. It's holding people back. People like you who've worked twice as hard to get half the recognition." Lydia narrowed her eyes. "Don't try to lump me in with the others. I've earned my place here. I didn't get here by complaining." "I'm not saying you didn't earn it," Vanessa said calmly. "I'm saying the system is built to make sure people like you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. You shouldn't have to fight for scraps. You should be running the show." Lydia's expression softened slightly, but she wasn't fully convinced. "And you think you can change that?" "I know we can," Vanessa replied, "but I can't do it without people like you, people who know the company inside and out, who've seen the way things really work." Lydia was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between her loyalty to the company and her frustration with the system that had tried to hold her back for so many years. Finally, she let out a long breath and nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm in. But if this goes south, I'm not going down with you." Vanessa smiled. "Fair enough." With Lydia on board, Vanessa's network was complete. She had allies in every department, people at every level of the company who were ready to push back against the entrenched racism and sexism that had held them back for so long. Now, it was time to act. The next phase of her plan would require precision, coordination, and a lot of courage. But Vanessa was ready. The storm was coming, and she was going to make sure that Whitman Enterprises would never be the same again. The groundwork had been laid. Vanessa's network of allies was steadily growing, and she felt the quiet surge of momentum. Yet, she knew that with every step forward, the pushback would grow stronger. Whitman Enterprises was built on a foundation of traditions that were designed to protect those at the top. The moment they realized Vanessa's coalition was not just a whisper, but a force, the real fight would begin. It didn't take long for the first signs of retaliation to appear. It started with subtle moves, the kind that were meant to intimidate without drawing attention. Vanessa noticed a sudden change in how certain tasks were being assigned, particularly among the people in her circle. Cynthia, who had always handled delicate HR matters, was abruptly reassigned to tedious, dead-end projects that kept her out of key discussions. Marcus, despite being instrumental in improving IT systems, saw his team repeatedly sidelined for new initiatives. Vanessa's own workload shifted as well. Important projects that she was once trusted to manage were quietly taken off her plate and handed to others. The message was clear. The leadership was preparing to suffocate her influence before it could take root. She anticipated all of this. It was exactly what she had expected from Paul and Eric, old guard executives who thrived on intimidation and control. But what they hadn't counted on was her ability to pivot. her readiness for this war of attrition. One day, as Vanessa entered her office, she was greeted by an email from Paul with a subject line that left no room for interpretation. Meeting at 3 p.m. Clarification of responsibilities. It was a thinly veiled attempt to reprimand her under the guise of clarification. She knew this meeting wouldn't just be about her, it was a strategic move to silence her influence. Vanessa arrived at the meeting 5 minutes early. Paul and Eric were already seated, their expressions composed, though Vanessa could feel the hostility beneath the surface. The room was designed to intimidate, with its oversized glass table and towering windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. The grandeur of the space wasn't lost on her. It was meant to remind everyone who held the power here. "Vanessa, thanks for joining us," Paul said with a disingenuous smile. He gestured toward the chair across from him, the seat clearly positioned to create a psychological imbalance. It was a tactic she had seen countless times before. Establish dominance before the conversation even began. Vanessa took her seat, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. "What's this about?" she asked, keeping her tone calm but firm. Paul leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. "We've been noticing some disruptions lately, people in certain departments deviating from their roles, certain lines being crossed, and we wanted to address it before it becomes a bigger issue." Eric chimed in, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It seems like you've been stepping into areas outside your scope. While we appreciate initiative, we need to ensure that everyone stays in their lane." Vanessa stared at them for a moment, not blinking, before leaning back in her chair. "Interesting. So when I make suggestions to improve the workflow in marketing, or when I collaborate with other departments to increase efficiency, that's me crossing lines? I thought this company valued teamwork." Paul's smile faltered. "It's not about teamwork, Vanessa. It's about hierarchy. Everyone has a role, and when people stray from theirs, it creates confusion and chaos. We need to maintain order." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Is that what you're really worried about? Order?" There was a charged silence in the room as Paul and Eric exchanged glances. Vanessa could feel the tension growing. They were used to their intimidation tactics working, but she wasn't here to play by their rules. "I don't think this meeting is really about maintaining order," Vanessa continued, her voice sharp now. "I think it's about control. You're uncomfortable because you're losing your grip. You're seeing people speak up, people who have been ignored or silenced for years, and that scares you." Paul's jaw tightened, and Eric's eyes narrowed, but neither of them spoke. "You talk about hierarchy," Vanessa said, leaning forward slightly. "But the truth is, the hierarchy here is built on discrimination. It's built on keeping certain people down while you promote others who look and think just like you. And it's not just me who sees it. More and more people are waking up to it." Paul's face darkened. "You need to be careful with your words, Vanessa." "I am careful," she replied coolly. "Careful enough to know that this system is rotting from the inside, and I'm not the only one who's tired of it." There was a moment of thick silence, the kind where the air seems to crackle with the weight of unspoken threats. Vanessa wasn't naive enough to think she had won. This was just the beginning, and she knew they would retaliate in more severe ways. But she also knew something they didn't. The tide was turning, and there were more people on her side than they realized. The following week was a barrage of bureaucratic warfare. Meetings were rescheduled without her knowledge, reports were lost before they could be reviewed, and her access to certain key documents was mysteriously revoked. The leadership had doubled down on their attempts to isolate her, to keep her out of the loop, and it was working, at least on the surface. Behind the scenes, however, Vanessa's coalition was growing stronger. She and her allies began holding their own private meetings, quietly strategizing how to gather more support without tipping off leadership too early. Marcus, with his IT expertise, began setting up encrypted channels for communication. Cynthia used her position in HR to gather critical intel on how the company's policies were being manipulated to keep people of color and women from advancing. The more Vanessa dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. Women, especially black women, were consistently denied promotions under the guise of not having enough leadership experience, even when they were more qualified than the white men who were promoted. Complaints about racial bias in performance evaluations were routinely dismissed or quietly buried. It was systemic, deliberate, and deeply ingrained. One day, during a lunch meeting with Marcus and Cynthia, Vanessa finally laid it all out. "We've been gathering evidence," she said, lowering her voice as they sat in a secluded corner of the cafe. "Everything from discriminatory hiring practices to racial bias in performance evaluations. It's all there, documented, but buried under layers of red tape." Marcus nodded, his face tense. "So what's the plan? We've got the information, but what do we do with it?" "We expose it," Vanessa said firmly. "We take it to the board directly. We bypass Paul, Eric, and all the others protecting this mess. If we can prove what's going on, we can force them to make changes." Cynthia frowned slightly. "You're talking about going over their heads. They'll try to bury you before you can even get a foot in the door." "I know," Vanessa said. "But we have more power than they think. If we can get enough employees to back us up, they won't be able to shut us down. Not without facing a major backlash." Marcus leaned forward. "So, what's the first step?" Vanessa met his gaze, her eyes sharp with determination. "We build the case. We gather as much evidence as we can, and when the time is right, we go public. This isn't just about me or you or Cynthia. It's about changing this company from the ground up." The next few weeks were intense. Vanessa and her allies worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies from employees who had experienced the same systemic discrimination. Every document, every email, every performance evaluation was carefully cataloged and stored. Marcus's encrypted communication channels ensured that their work remained hidden from prying eyes. But Vanessa knew that secrecy could only protect them for so long. The more evidence they gathered, the more dangerous their position became. Paul and Eric were already suspicious, and their moves against her were becoming more aggressive. Vanessa's days were filled with sudden, urgent meetings designed to waste her time, while her team was assigned increasingly impossible tasks meant to overwhelm them. It was all a calculated effort to make her slip, to force her out through exhaustion. But Vanessa was prepared for the long game. She had anticipated every move, every tactic they would throw at her. The company's leadership was playing checkers, while Vanessa was playing chess. The final push came when Vanessa received an anonymous tip late one evening. A package was delivered to her apartment, an unmarked manila envelope. Inside were internal emails between Paul, Eric, and other top executives, openly discussing their efforts to manage certain employees, particularly women of color, to prevent them from rising too quickly. The language was coded, but the intent was unmistakable. They were orchestrating the slow suffocation of anyone who didn't fit into their narrow vision of leadership. Vanessa stared at the papers in front of her, anger and resolve building in her chest. This was it, the smoking gun. She grabbed her phone and called Marcus and Cynthia. "We have everything we need," she said, her voice steely. "It's time to bring this to the board." As Vanessa prepared for the biggest move of her career, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong step, and she could lose everything. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was ready for the storm that was about to hit Whitman Enterprises. Vanessa stood before the mirror in her small, modest apartment, straightening the collar of her blouse. Her reflection stared back at her, a reminder of the battle that lay ahead. Today wasn't just another day at Whitman Enterprises. It was the day she would take her case to the board, exposing the rotten core of the company's leadership. She had all the pieces in place, all the evidence meticulously gathered, and a network of allies ready to support her. But this wasn't going to be easy. Vanessa had always known that Paul and Eric would fight back, but now, with the explosive information in her hands, the stakes had reached a dangerous level. She was about to accuse the most powerful men in the company of orchestrating a systematic campaign of racism and sexism. There was no turning back. As she walked into Whitman Enterprises that morning, the tension in the air was palpable. She had sent out word to her core group. Marcus, Cynthia, Lydia, and a few others. They were ready, waiting for her signal. The plan was simple. Gather in the break room for one final briefing before she and Marcus went upstairs to the boardroom. Vanessa stepped into the break room, her heels echoing against the linoleum floor. Her team was already there, a mix of nervous faces and quiet determination. Marcus was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, his expression serious. Cynthia stood nearby, her eyes scanning the room as though anticipating the worst. "Everyone ready?" Vanessa asked, her voice calm but firm. Marcus nodded. "We're with you." Lydia, standing with her arms folded across her chest, let out a low breath. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this. Going straight to the board? This is serious." "We don't have a choice," Vanessa replied. "Paul and Eric won't stop until they've crushed anyone who stands in their way. We've seen it before. They tried to bury us in busy work, push us out quietly. But now we have the proof of what they've been doing." Cynthia pulled out a folder, filled with printed emails, performance evaluations, and internal documents. "This is everything," she said, passing it to Vanessa. "We've cross-referenced it all. They can't refute it." Vanessa took the folder, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was it, the culmination of months of secret meetings, late-night planning sessions, and quiet defiance. She glanced at Marcus. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he said with a slight smile, though she could see the tension in his jaw. "We're going to make this work," she assured him, though the knot in her stomach told her how high the stakes truly were. "Just follow my lead, and whatever happens, we stay calm." Marcus nodded, and together they left the break room, heading toward the elevators that would take them to the top floor, the boardroom. The elevator ride felt like it lasted an eternity, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Marcus fidgeted with the buttons on his suit jacket, while Vanessa kept her eyes forward, her mind focused on the confrontation ahead. This wasn't just about their careers. It was about changing the toxic culture that had infected Whitman Enterprises from the top down. It was about dismantling the systemic racism and sexism that had kept women and people of color from rising through the ranks. As the elevator doors slid open, they stepped out into the hushed corridor of the executive floor. The plush carpet muffled their footsteps as they made their way toward the imposing double doors of the boardroom. Vanessa could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was the battle she had been preparing for. When they reached the doors, Marcus hesitated for a split second, then gave Vanessa a brief nod. She took a deep breath and pushed the doors open. Inside, the boardroom was already filled with the company's top brass. The long, gleaming table was surrounded by the faces of the board members, most of whom were older, white men in expensive suits. At the head of the table sat Paul, his expression one of controlled arrogance, while Eric was seated to his right, his eyes narrowing as Vanessa and Marcus entered the room. Paul's lips curled into a thin smile. "Vanessa, Marcus, what a surprise!" "We're not here for pleasantries," Vanessa said, her voice steady as she walked toward the center of the room. "We're here because there's something the board needs to see." She placed the folder on the table, right in front of the board's chairman, Mr. Andrews, a silver-haired man who had always prided himself on the company's supposed ethical leadership. Vanessa could feel his eyes on her as she slid the folder toward him. Paul's smile faded slightly, his gaze flicking to the folder. "And what exactly is this?" Vanessa met his gaze without flinching. "Proof. Proof that you and Eric have been systematically discriminating against women and people of color in this company. Proof that you've been manipulating performance reviews, denying promotions, and creating a culture of fear and intimidation to keep anyone who doesn't fit your mold from rising through the ranks." A murmur rippled through the room, the board members exchanging uneasy glances. Mr. Andrews opened the folder, his brows furrowing as he began to flip through the documents. "This is ridiculous," Eric scoffed, his voice laced with contempt. "You really think you can come in here and—" "Sit down, Eric," Vanessa cut him off, her voice ice-cold. "We're not playing your game anymore." Eric's face flushed with anger, But before he could retort, Mr. Andrews raised a hand. "I think we need to hear what Vanessa has to say." Paul leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "This is absurd. She's clearly trying to undermine us." "Undermine you?" Vanessa shot back, her eyes blazing with fury. "You've been undermining people like me, like Marcus, like Cynthia for years. We have the emails, the performance evaluations, the testimony from employees who've seen exactly how you operate. You've built this company on discrimination, and now it's time to face the consequences." There was a heavy silence in the room as Vanessa's words hung in the air. The tension was palpable, but Vanessa refused to back down. She knew that this was her moment to push forward, to force them to confront the reality they had been hiding behind for so long. Mr. Andrews continued to flip through the documents, his face growing more serious with each page he turned. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up, his expression grave. "These are very serious allegations," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If this evidence holds up, we'll need to launch a full investigation." Paul's face twisted in fury. "You can't be serious. This is nothing more than a witch hunt." "It's the truth, and you know it," Vanessa said, cutting him off once again. "You can try to deny it, but the evidence is all here. And if the board won't take action, then we'll go public. We'll take this to the media, and we'll expose everything." Another murmur rippled through the boardroom, this time louder, more anxious. Vanessa could see the board members' faces, some shocked, others deeply concerned. They knew the damage this could do to Whitman Enterprises' reputation. Paul slammed his fist on the table. "You're playing a dangerous game, Vanessa." "I'm not playing anything," Vanessa said, her voice calm but steely. "I'm fighting for the people you've oppressed, for the women who've been told they're not leadership material, and the people of color who've been passed over for promotions they deserved." Eric, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "You'll ruin this company with these lies. You'll destroy everything." Vanessa locked eyes with him. "No, Eric. You and Paul already did that. I'm here to fix it." The room fell silent again, the weight of Vanessa's words settling over everyone. Mr. Andrews, who had been listening carefully to the entire exchange, closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "We'll need to discuss this further," he said gravely. "But if what you're saying is true, Vanessa, then this company will need to make significant changes, starting at the top." Paul and Eric exchanged a panicked look, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The board couldn't ignore the evidence, not with everything Vanessa had laid out in front of them. Vanessa felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. There would be more battles to come, more resistance from those who had spent their careers building walls of discrimination. But for now, she had taken the first step in tearing those walls down. As the meeting adjourned and Vanessa and Marcus walked out of the boardroom, Marcus turned to her, his face a mix of relief and disbelief. "I can't believe we just did that." Vanessa smiled, though her expression remained serious. "This is just the beginning. Now, we make sure they can't bury it." The storm had hit Whitman Enterprises, and nothing would ever be the same. But for the first time in a long time, Vanessa felt like she was on the right side of it. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken a major step toward victory. And she wasn't backing down. Not until the company was transformed from the inside out. Weeks passed since the dramatic showdown in the boardroom. An internal investigation had been launched, and Paul and Eric found themselves under intense scrutiny. The atmosphere at Whitman Enterprises had shifted dramatically. People were talking more openly, feeling the winds of change sweeping through the halls of a company that had once been mired in secrecy and discrimination. Vanessa stayed focused. She knew that, even with the investigation underway, Paul and Eric would try to find a way to protect themselves. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The emails, the manipulated performance reviews, and the testimonies from employees who had suffered under their leadership were irrefutable. During this time, Vanessa worked even harder to support the employees who had been silenced for so long. She and Marcus helped implement informal mentorship programs, organized meetings between different departments, and began planting the seeds of a new culture that valued collaboration, diversity, and fairness. But the real turning point came on a Friday afternoon when Vanessa received a call from Mr. Andrews, the chairman of the board. His voice was calm but carried the weight of the decision they had been waiting for. "Vanessa, can you come to the boardroom? We need to discuss the results of the investigation." Vanessa's heart raced, but she kept her composure. This was it, the moment she had worked so hard for. When she stepped into the boardroom, it was filled with the familiar faces of the board members, their expressions somber but resolute. Paul and Eric were noticeably absent. Vanessa stood in front of them, her head held high. "Vanessa," Mr. Andrews began, "we've concluded our investigation. The evidence you provided was damning. We cannot allow such behavior to continue within this company. As of today, Paul and Eric are no longer part of Whitman Enterprises." A wave of relief washed over her, but she knew there was more to come. Mr. Andrews continued. "The board has spent the last several days discussing the future of this company. We've seen the impact you've had in such a short time, and it's clear to us that we need new leadership, someone who understands what this company needs, someone who can rebuild trust and guide us through this transition." He paused, and Vanessa held her breath. "Vanessa, we would like to offer you the position of CEO of Whitman Enterprises." For a moment, the room seemed to go completely silent. Vanessa felt a mixture of shock, pride, and determination. This was the opportunity she had been fighting for, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under the old regime. The weight of the responsibility was immense, but Vanessa was ready. "I accept," she said firmly, her voice steady. "But this is just the beginning. If we're going to make real change, it can't stop here. We need to rebuild from the ground up." Mr. Andrews smiled. "We know you'll do exactly that, Vanessa." In the days that followed, Vanessa's appointment as CEO became official. The news spread quickly through the company, and the reaction was electric. Employees who had once been silenced now felt empowered to speak up. Departments that had been siloed began to work together. And Vanessa, now sitting in the office once occupied by Paul, set her sights on transforming Whitman Enterprises into the company it should have always been. Her first order of business was to implement new policies to prevent the kind of discrimination and harassment that had plagued the company for years. She worked with HR to create a clear, transparent process for reporting issues and ensured that there were real consequences for those who violated the company's new code of ethics. But it wasn't just about fixing the problems of the past. Vanessa had a vision for the future. She wanted to build a culture of inclusion, where diverse voices were not just heard, but valued. She pushed for more women and people of color in leadership positions, knowing that real change would only come when the people making decisions reflected the diversity of the world outside the company walls. Vanessa also made sure that employees at all levels had access to mentorship and training programs, so that anyone, regardless of their background, had the opportunity to rise through the ranks based on their talent and hard work. As she walked through the office one afternoon, she passed by Marcus, who was now thriving in his new role as head of operations. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had fought for together. "Congratulations, CEO Whitman," Marcus said with a grin. Vanessa smiled, feeling the weight of her new title. "Thanks, Marcus. But remember, it's just Vanessa." Months later, as Vanessa sat at her desk in the CEO's office, she looked out over the city skyline. It was a beautiful evening, the sun casting a warm glow over the buildings. Whitman Enterprises was changing, evolving into something better, something stronger. And while there was still much work to be done, Vanessa knew she had made a real difference. The road to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and hardship. But through it all, Vanessa had remained true to herself and to the values she believed in. Now, as the first black woman to lead the company, she was ready to take Whitman Enterprises into the future, a future where people were judged by their talents and character, not by their race or gender. As the sun set on another day, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile on her face. She had done it, and this was only the beginning, the end. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Write in the comments what you think about the heroine and her path to success. And also check out our other stories. Just click on one of the videos you see on your screen. Your support helps us tell important stories.